Number 1. Roshonara Choudhry. It happened in broad daylight, inside a quiet community library in East London. A young woman approached her local member of parliament, reached into her bag, and pulled out a kitchen knife. Within seconds, one of the UK's most shocking political attacks in recent memory had unfolded. Not by a seasoned extremist, but by a quiet university student with no prior criminal record. Roshonara Choudhry was born and raised in East London, the daughter of Bangladeshi immigrants. She was a bright student, excelling in school and eventually earning a place at King's College London to study English and communications. Teachers and peers described her as quiet, respectful, and deeply religious, though not known for any radical views. For most of her young life, there was nothing to suggest she would become involved in anything criminal, let alone violent. But in the months leading up to her crime, something shifted, and no one saw it coming. The turning point began online. In 2009, Choudhry became increasingly absorbed in the teachings of Anwar al-Awlaki, a Yemen-based cleric affiliated with al-Qaeda. Through YouTube videos and sermons, al-Awlaki preached anti-Western ideology and called for violent action against perceived enemies of Islam. Choudhry, by her own later account, watched more than 100 hours of his material. At some point during her final year at university, she made a drastic and secret decision. She would punish a British lawmaker who had supported the Iraq War. Her target became Stephen Timms, the Labour MP for East Ham. Timms had voted in favor of the war back in 2003, something Choudhry viewed as a betrayal of innocent Muslims. She later said she believed killing him would make her a martyr. With chilling calculation, she researched his public schedule, learned about his regular constituency meetings, and chose a date to strike. On May 14, 2010, Choudhry walked into the Becton Globe Library in East London, where Timms was holding a public surgery, a session where constituents could meet him face to face. She waited her turn in line. When it was time, she smiled, greeted him politely, and reached into her bag. Without warning, she stabbed him twice in the abdomen with a 3-inch kitchen knife. Timms fell backward in shock, seriously wounded but alive. Staff members and security personnel rushed in to restrain her until police arrived. Stephen Timms was rushed to the hospital, where surgeons found that the knife had narrowly missed his vital organs. He would survive, but the attack shocked the political world. Timms himself later described the experience as surreal. He never imagined being attacked by someone so young, so composed. Choudhry was arrested at the scene. In interviews with police, she confessed almost immediately, expressing no remorse. She told detectives she had carried out the attack to punish Timms for supporting the Iraq War and that she had acted alone. Perhaps most unsettling was her calm demeanor. She said she did not regret what she had done and viewed it as part of her religious duty. The investigation quickly turned to how a seemingly ordinary student had become radicalized. Authorities traced her internet activity and confirmed that she had been watching large amounts of extremist content online, particularly sermons by Anwar al-Awlaki. At the time, YouTube and other platforms had not yet implemented rigorous moderation of such content. The case raised serious concerns about the ease with which vulnerable individuals could be influenced by online propaganda. In court, Roshonara Choudhry refused to attend her own trial. She was charged with attempted murder and 2 counts of possessing an offensive weapon. Her defense team offered little in the way of argument, as she had already confessed in full. The judge, Mr. Justice Cook, described her actions as an attempt to murder a member of parliament for purely ideological reasons, and one that was calculated and deliberate. On November 3, 2010, Choudhry was found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 15 years. She showed no reaction as the sentence was read out. She was 21 years old. Stephen Timms recovered quickly and returned to Parliament just weeks after the attack, earning respect for his calm response and refusal to stoke division. But the emotional scars ran deeper. Roshonara Choudhry's case sparked national outrage, highlighting the dangers of online radicalization. YouTube rushed to remove extremist content, and the government expanded counter-extremism efforts targeting youth. What shocked many was Choudhry's ordinariness. No record, no terror ties, just a quiet student radicalized alone in a dorm room. She remains in prison, unrepentant and in isolation, never having appealed her sentence. The attack in a quiet East London library shattered the myth that radicalization is distant. It was sudden, local, and came from someone no one expected. Number 2. Lori Vallow Daybell. It started with a mother's calm smile on a courtroom bench and ended with the discovery of 2 small bodies buried in a backyard grave. Behind the headlines of missing children and courtroom chaos was something far darker, a chilling belief that some people, even your own kids, could be possessed by evil and had to die to fulfill a divine plan. Before the media dubbed her the Doomsday Mom, Lori Vallow Daybell appeared to lead a fairly ordinary life. Born in California in 1973, she was a former beauty pageant contestant and worked in the suburbs of Arizona as a wife and mother. Friends described her as charming, charismatic, and devoted to her family. But over time, Lori became deeply obsessed with fringe religious teachings, ones that reinterpreted mainstream Mormon doctrine into something extreme and apocalyptic. That transformation intensified when she met Chad Daybell, a religious author and podcaster who claimed to receive visions from God. Chad had written multiple books centered around the end times, portraying himself as a spiritual warrior chosen to lead the faithful through an imminent apocalypse. When he and Lori met at a religious event in 2018, their connection was instant. They believed they were sealed for eternity, spiritual leaders handpicked for a divine mission. Together, they created a framework of belief that would justify unthinkable crimes. By early 2019, Lori's grip on reality had visibly shifted. She claimed certain people around her had become zombies, individuals whose souls were replaced by dark spirits. Among those she labeled as possessed were her own children, 16-year-old Tylee Ryan and 7-year-old J.J. Vallow. At the same time, she became increasingly distant from her family, severing contact with relatives who raised questions or concerns. In September 2019, both children vanished from their home in Rexburg, Idaho. Lori offered vague explanations. Tylee was away at college, J.J. was with a friend, but no one actually saw or heard from them. Strangely, Lori didn't report them missing. Instead, she went on vacation, married Chad just weeks after his wife's sudden death, and relocated to Hawaii, seemingly unfazed by the growing questions. Meanwhile, the children's grandparents sounded the alarm. After failed attempts to speak with JJ, they contacted authorities and filed a missing persons report. Police in Rexburg launched an investigation that quickly grew more alarming. Lori and Chad had lied repeatedly about the kids' whereabouts. Text messages revealed efforts to cover their tracks. And when law enforcement finally obtained a warrant to search Chad's property in June 2020, they found what everyone feared: 2 shallow graves. Inside were the remains of Tylee and JJ, buried just steps from Chad's backyard fire pit. The details of the case only grew more disturbing from there. Investigators uncovered a timeline of manipulation and death. Lori's previous husband, Charles Vallow, had been killed by her brother months before the children disappeared. Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell, died suddenly and was buried without an autopsy, until suspicions prompted her exhumation. Evidence suggested a coordinated plan by Lori, Chad, and a small circle of followers, fueled by their apocalyptic beliefs. They viewed certain deaths as spiritually necessary, part of a cleansing ritual to prepare for the second coming. The legal process was long and emotionally charged. Lori Vallow Daybell was eventually charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and grand theft in connection with her children's deaths and the suspicious death of Tammy Daybell. During her trial in 2023, prosecutors painted a picture of a woman driven by delusion, ambition, and blind faith in a man who believed he could speak for God. The courtroom heard chilling testimony about Lori's belief system and how she came to see her children as spiritually compromised. Her defense argued that Lori had been manipulated by Chad and was mentally unwell, but jurors were unconvinced. In May 2023, Lori Vallow Daybell was found guilty on all major charges. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She showed little emotion as the sentence was handed down. The public reaction to the case was intense. News outlets across the world followed every development, with many struggling to comprehend how a mother could become convinced her children needed to die. The case sparked renewed conversations about religious extremism, mental health, and the dangers of unchecked online communities that feed radical beliefs. Authorities also faced criticism for delays in connecting the dots, especially between the deaths of Charles Vallow, Tammy Daybell, and the children. Multiple jurisdictions were involved, and some now believe earlier intervention could have saved lives. Today, Lori remains incarcerated, with no possibility of release. Chad Daybell is also facing trial for his alleged role in the killings, and could face the death penalty. As more evidence emerges, the case continues to horrify and fascinate the public in equal measure. But perhaps the most haunting part of the story isn't the beliefs themselves. It's how far two people were willing to go to act on them. In the end, two young lives were lost not because of hatred or money, but because the people closest to them claimed to love them, while convinced they weren't really there anymore. Number 3. Tashfeen Malik. The holiday party at the Inland Regional Center had just begun. Co-workers mingled, took photos, and celebrated the season. Among them was a familiar face, quiet, modest, almost invisible in the crowd. But she wasn't there to celebrate. Just minutes later, she and her husband walked in armed, opening fire in one of the deadliest mass shootings in California's history. Tashfeen Malik's life began far from Southern California. She was born in Pakistan in 1986 and spent much of her childhood in Saudi Arabia, raised in a conservative Islamic household. By most accounts, her early life was unremarkable, reserved, religious, and structured. She later returned to Pakistan to study pharmacy at Bahauddin Zakaria University. It was during these years that her beliefs began to shift. While not publicly vocal about politics or extremism, investigators would later find signs of deepening radical views. In 2013, she met Syed Rizwan Farouk, a U.S.-born health inspector from Riverside, California, through an online matrimonial website. He, too, was devoutly religious and reportedly searching for a wife who shared his conservative values. After a brief courtship, they married and settled in the United States. Malik moved to San Bernardino on a fiancé visa and quickly disappeared from public view. Neighbors recalled little interaction with the couple, who lived quietly and raised their infant daughter in a modest home. Outwardly, their life appeared typical, but behind the scenes, the couple was amassing weapons, practicing at shooting ranges, and expressing extremist beliefs in private messages. According to the FBI, they were self-radicalized over the course of several years. They were not part of an official terror cell, but their ideology closely aligned with the Islamic State's message. In fact, on the day of the attack, Malik pledged allegiance to the group's leader on Facebook, just moments before opening fire. On the morning of December 2, 2015, Syed Farouk attended a holiday training event at the San Bernardino Department of Public Health, where he worked. Around midday, he abruptly left. 2 hours later, he returned with Tashfeen Malik. Both were dressed in tactical gear and heavily armed. They entered the conference room and opened fire on Farouk's colleagues, many of whom had shared lunch with him just hours earlier. In total, 14 people were killed and 22 others injured in a matter of minutes. The attack was methodical, calculated, and brutal. After the shooting, the couple fled the scene in a black SUV, leaving behind a bomb that failed to detonate. A massive manhunt followed. 4 hours later, police located them just a few miles away. A tense chase and shootout ensued. When the gunfire stopped, both Farouk and Malik were dead. Inside the SUV and their home, authorities found thousands of rounds of ammunition, pipe bombs, and a clear digital trail of ideological radicalization. Because both shooters died during the incident, there was no trial, no courtroom testimony, no direct interrogation. But through digital records, investigators pieced together the couple's path to violence. Malik had communicated with extremists overseas and consumed a steady stream of radical content online. In the months before the attack, the couple had meticulously planned every detail. This was not a spontaneous outburst. It was premeditated domestic terrorism. The public reaction was swift and wide-reaching. The San Bernardino attack marked a turning point in how Americans viewed homegrown extremism. It wasn't just the scale of the violence, it was the fact that the perpetrators were a married couple with a baby at home. There were no obvious warning signs, no prior arrests, no affiliation with known terror groups. They had blended in. That, perhaps, was the most terrifying part. The case also raised urgent questions about immigration screening. Malik had passed multiple background checks when she entered the U.S. on a K-1 visa, but her extremist leanings had not been detected. Critics pushed for stricter vetting processes, particularly for fiancé and spousal visa applications. In response, the Department of Homeland Security implemented new measures to expand social media screening and interagency cooperation. The FBI labeled the shooting an act of terror within days. The investigation later confirmed the attack was ideologically motivated, but not directed by ISIS leadership. The couple had drawn inspiration from the group's propaganda, but acted independently. This made their case especially difficult to predict, and even harder to prevent. In the aftermath, stories of the victims began to emerge. Health workers, environmental specialists, and office staff who had come together for a holiday lunch and never made it home. Their loss left a gaping wound in the San Bernardino community. In response, memorials were held across the country, and support poured in from both government leaders and ordinary citizens. Tashfeen Malik's name remains infamous, not just for the violence she helped unleash, but for what she symbolized. She was the quiet woman in the corner, the young mother who shopped at local stores, the neighbor who didn't raise suspicion. And yet, she carried out one of the most devastating mass shootings in recent history. There was no manifesto, no courtroom apology, no final words, just a string of digital echoes, a trail of ideology, and two shallow graves for the people they left behind. Number 4. Naomi Elkins. The call came from a quiet New Jersey neighborhood just after sunrise. 2 young children were found unresponsive in a bathtub. Their mother stood nearby, soaked and silent. What followed was a case so deeply unsettling, it left both the public and professionals struggling to understand. How could a woman entrusted to care for children take the lives of her own, and say she did it in the name of faith? Naomi Elkins was, by most appearances, an ordinary 27-year-old mother. Living in a modest home in southern New Jersey, she worked at a local daycare and was known to neighbors as soft-spoken, private, and deeply religious. Friends described her as attentive to her children and involved in her church community. There were no prior arrests, no history of violence, and no obvious red flags, until everything unraveled over the course of one tragic spring morning in 2024. On June 1st, police were called to Elkins's home after a relative reportedly found the children unresponsive. First responders arrived to a devastating scene. Her 2 daughters, just 1 and 3 years old, had been drowned in the bathtub. One of them, the older girl, had also been stabbed multiple times. Elkins herself was taken into custody at the scene without resistance. During questioning, she offered a haunting explanation. According to police reports, Elkins stated she had acted for religious purposes, claiming that she had prayed intensely the night before and believed she was carrying out a spiritual instruction. The statements she made in the hours following her arrest were fragmented, disjointed, and deeply troubling. She spoke about evil, redemption, and her children being taken away from sin. Detectives immediately flagged the situation as one involving potential mental health issues layered with intense religious fixation. The murders shook the small community of Pittsgrove Township, where Elkins had lived and worked. For those who had trusted her with their own children, the news was nearly impossible to process. "She always seemed gentle," one parent said. "We never imagined anything like this." As investigators searched the home and reviewed her digital activity, they found no clear warning signs. But interviews with those close to Elkins painted a more complicated picture. She had reportedly been withdrawing in the months prior, isolating herself from family, skipping work shifts, and showing signs of growing paranoia. Some neighbors noted that she spoke increasingly about spiritual warfare and divine messages. But none of it appeared threatening until it was far too late. Authorities charged Elkins with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and she was quickly transferred to Salem County Correctional Facility. At her initial court appearance, she appeared disoriented, barely responding to the judge's questions. Her defense attorney soon announced they would pursue an insanity defense, citing a history of untreated mental illness, possibly postpartum related, and religious delusions. Court filings referenced repeated hallucinations, sleepless nights, and voices that she allegedly believed were from God. Prosecutors, however, argued that her actions were deliberate and premeditated. They pointed to her internet searches, her composed behavior after the act, and the fact that she made no attempt to flee. They described the killings as acts rooted in distorted religious belief, not spontaneous psychosis. The case now sits in a legal limbo. As of mid-2025, Elkins has been ruled competent to stand trial, though psychological evaluations remain ongoing. The court has scheduled a full jury trial for early 2026, where the central question will likely revolve around Elkins' state of mind at the time of the crime. Was she fully aware of what she was doing? Or was she in the grip of a profound and untreated mental health crisis? In the meantime, the case has reignited conversations about the intersection of religion and mental illness, particularly when warning signs are vague or dismissed as harmless faith. Experts in forensic psychology have pointed out how difficult it can be to distinguish between devout belief and dangerous delusion, especially when someone operates in isolation. Public reaction to the case has been divided and emotional. Some have expressed compassion for Elkins, citing the pressures of single motherhood, untreated psychosis, and spiritual confusion. Others, especially within the local community, view her actions as unforgivable, a betrayal of both maternal duty and basic humanity. The deaths of the 2 young girls, whose names have not been widely released out of respect for surviving relatives, remain a source of grief and outrage. Community members have held candlelight vigils and fundraisers in their memory, with many calling for better support systems for struggling mothers and greater access to mental health care. For now, Naomi Elkins sits in a holding cell, awaiting trial. She has not spoken publicly since her arrest. The only statements on record come from her early interviews with detectives, rambling, disturbing, and filled with references to divine instruction and spiritual warfare. If convicted, she faces life in prison. If found not guilty by reason of insanity, she could spend the rest of her life in a psychiatric facility. Either way, the question remains: what happens when someone's mind becomes a battlefield between faith and delusion, and the casualties are their own children? Number 5. Safiyya Shaikh. She walked through one of London's most iconic churches, gazing at its vast dome and whispering prayers. But Safiyya Shaikh wasn't there to worship. She was planning where to hide a bomb. What she didn't know, what ultimately stopped her plan, was that the people helping her were watching every move, because they were undercover. Born Michelle Ramsden in West London in 1983, Sheikh's early life was marked by instability. Raised in a troubled household, she drifted through life feeling isolated and angry. She struggled with drug addiction and mental health issues, and, by her own admission, spent years searching for belonging. That search took a sharp and dangerous turn when she converted to Islam in 2007. Initially, her conversion was genuine, motivated by a desire for structure and purpose. But over time, Shaikh gravitated toward extremist circles online, particularly content linked to ISIS. By 2015, she had become a vocal supporter of the terror group on social media, praising attacks in the West and urging others to join the cause. She operated under multiple aliases, running encrypted Telegram channels and engaging with like-minded extremists across Europe. It was in 2019 that her intentions moved from talk to action. Shaikh began plotting a suicide bombing targeting St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the most recognizable landmarks in the United Kingdom. Her plan was chillingly simple: detonate an explosive device inside the cathedral during Easter celebrations, when crowds of tourists and worshippers would be present. In parallel, she planned to plant a second bomb at a nearby hotel and considered using a suicide vest for maximum destruction. She didn't want to survive the attack. But what she didn't know was that she had already been on the radar of counterterrorism authorities. Undercover operatives posing as extremist sympathizers made contact with her. When Shaikh asked for help in sourcing explosives, she was introduced to a supposed couple who could build and deliver the devices. In reality, they were officers with Britain's Metropolitan Police. Over a series of meetings and encrypted chats, Shaikh laid out her plans. She sent photos of St. Paul's interior, discussed timing and logistics, and reiterated her willingness to die for the cause. She even delivered a bag to the undercover officers, believing it would be filled with functioning explosives. That exchange, and the evidence it provided, was enough. On October 10, 2019, police arrested Shaikh before she could take another step. A subsequent search of her home uncovered handwritten notes pledging allegiance to ISIS, as well as further evidence of radical material. She confessed almost immediately. At trial, Shaikh pleaded guilty to 4 terrorism-related offenses, including preparation of terrorist acts and dissemination of terrorist publications. Prosecutors described her as deeply radicalized and determined to kill as many people as possible. She had made clear in multiple communications that her hatred for the West and her commitment to ISIS ideology were absolute. The court heard that Shaikh had traveled to St. Paul's multiple times, scoping out the security layout and entry points. She also attempted to radicalize others online, including vulnerable individuals she believed she could influence. In sentencing, the judge emphasized that this was no idle fantasy. Shaikh had taken concrete steps toward carrying out mass murder and remained unrepentant. In February 2020, she was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 14 years. During the hearing, she offered no expression of remorse. A psychiatric evaluation confirmed that she understood the consequences of her actions and that her beliefs were ideological, not symptomatic of delusion. The case sent ripples through the UK public and counterterrorism community. St. Paul's Cathedral is not just a religious site, it's a national symbol associated with resilience during the Blitz and the funerals of great statesmen. The idea that it was nearly the scene of a mass casualty terror attack during a major Christian holiday was deeply unsettling. Experts noted that Shaikh represented a particularly dangerous profile. A self-radicalized lone actor with no direct operational ties to organized terror networks, but a deep commitment to their ideology. These types of cases are notoriously difficult to detect until the individual takes direct action. Had she not reached out for assistance in sourcing explosives, her plan might have gone unnoticed. Her conversion and subsequent radicalization also reignited discussions about the role of online propaganda, as well as the challenges facing vulnerable individuals who fall into extremist rabbit holes. Shaikh had bounced between communities for years before finding what she thought was purpose in violent ideology. Her descent was gradual, digital, and largely invisible until it reached its breaking point. Since her sentencing, Shaikh has remained in a high-security facility in the UK, where she continues to serve her life sentence. Authorities say she remains under close watch due to the possibility of attempting to influence others, even from behind bars. What began as a search for identity ended in a plot to kill innocents inside a place of worship. And if not for two undercover officers posing as allies, that search might have ended with far greater tragedy. Number 6. Wanda Barzee. It was a warm summer night in Salt Lake City when 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart vanished from her bedroom without a trace. The window screen had been cut. Her sister, lying just feet away, had watched helplessly as a man with a knife led Elizabeth into the dark. For 9 long months, the world searched. But behind the headlines and heartbreak, another figure quietly enabled the crime. Wanda Barzee, the woman who stood by as a child, was held captive, claiming it was all part of God's plan. Wanda Barzee was born and raised in Utah, deeply rooted in the Latter-day Saint community. But her life took a chaotic path. By the early 2000s, she was estranged from much of her family, struggled with mental illness, and had become immersed in fringe religious beliefs. Alongside her husband, Brian David Mitchell, she had abandoned mainstream Mormonism in favor of a warped theology, one where Mitchell declared himself a prophet, and Barzee accepted his every word as divine. In 2002, Mitchell began claiming that God had commanded him to take multiple wives in preparation for an impending apocalypse. He believed he was fulfilling a holy mission, and Barzee didn't just go along with it, she actively supported it. That mission, tragically, would lead them to Elizabeth Smart. On June 5, 2002, Mitchell broke into the Smart family home in the early hours of the morning. Barzee waited nearby, reportedly helping to plan the abduction. Once Mitchell had taken Elizabeth into the mountains behind Salt Lake City, it was Barzee who performed the so-called wedding ceremony, binding Elizabeth to Mitchell as a spiritual wife. For the next 9 months, the teen was forced to live in a makeshift camp just miles from her own home, subjected to religious abuse and threats of divine punishment if she resisted. Barzee's role during this time was not passive. She helped disguise Elizabeth, monitored her movements, and reinforced Mitchell's twisted theology. When Elizabeth cried or begged to go home, Barzee scolded her and reminded her of her sacred duty. Investigators and prosecutors later revealed that Barzee would sing hymns and read scriptures aloud to justify the abuse, all while ensuring Elizabeth remained isolated from the outside world. Despite being spotted multiple times in public with Mitchell and Elizabeth, who wore a veil and went by an alias, law enforcement was unable to act without clearer evidence. It wasn't until March 2003, when a sharp-eyed citizen recognized the trio in Sandy, Utah, that Elizabeth was finally rescued. Police stopped them on the street. Elizabeth hesitated at first, but then confirmed her identity. After 276 days in captivity, she was going home. Mitchell and Barzee were arrested on the spot. For years, the legal process dragged on as both defendants underwent psychiatric evaluations. Mitchell was ultimately convicted in 2010 and sentenced to life in prison. Barzee, meanwhile, accepted a plea deal in 2009. She pleaded guilty to kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor across state lines. In court, she admitted to her role in the abduction and captivity of Elizabeth Smart. But her statements were erratic, one moment apologetic, the next deflective. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Due to time already served in custody and credit for good behavior, she was released in 2018, a decision that shocked and angered much of the public. Elizabeth Smart, now an adult and an advocate for missing children, was outspoken about Barzee's release. She called it incomprehensible, emphasizing that Barzee had not shown any genuine remorse and still posed a potential threat. Authorities confirmed that even in prison, Barzee had expressed continued support for Mitchell's apocalyptic beliefs and had refused to take medication for diagnosed mental illnesses. Barzee's release came with strict conditions: lifetime supervision, GPS monitoring, and restrictions on proximity to children. She was placed in a supervised residence in Salt Lake City, but her presence prompted protests and concern from local residents, especially given her proximity to schools and churches. She has remained largely out of the public eye since, but the legacy of her involvement lingers. The broader fallout of the case was profound. The smart kidnapping led to significant changes in how child abductions are handled in the U.S., including the expansion of the Amber Alert system and improvements in how law enforcement collaborates across jurisdictions. It also brought national attention to the issue of religiously motivated abuse and the disturbing ways ideology can be used to justify control and violence. Wanda Barzee wasn't the one holding the knife the night Elizabeth Smart was taken, but she was the one who made it feel like there was no way out. She stood beside her husband not just as a partner, but as a believer, using scripture as chains. And while she walks free today, under supervision, the damage she helped cause continues to echo in the life of the girl she once tried to turn into a servant of someone else's twisted prophecy. Number 7. Colleen LaRose. She was a blonde, blue-eyed woman from suburban Pennsylvania, quiet, unassuming. She volunteered at her apartment complex and cared for her boyfriend's elderly father. But behind the keyboard, she called herself Jihad Jane, and she was plotting a murder for a cause she believed was holy. Colleen LaRose's path to radicalization didn't begin with violence. It began with loneliness. Born in 1963 in Michigan, she had a difficult upbringing marked by trauma and abuse. She dropped out of school in her early teens, married young, and later moved to Texas. Over the years, LaRose struggled with depression, substance abuse, and a series of failed relationships. By the time she reached her mid-40s, she was living in Pennsylvania and spending most of her time online. In 2008, after watching a video on YouTube about the suffering of Muslims in war zones, LaRose converted to Islam. It was a sudden shift, intense and all-consuming. She adopted the name Fatima LaRose and began frequenting extremist forums, expressing anger at Western foreign policy and sympathy for jihadist causes. Online, she found something she hadn't had before: a sense of belonging. LaRose soon became involved in a loosely connected network of radicals. Through encrypted chats and message boards, she connected with operatives in Europe and the Middle East who saw her as an asset, an American woman with a clean record and the ability to travel undetected. Her mission, as she later confessed, was clear: assassinate Swedish artist Lars Vilks, who had drawn cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad in ways some found offensive. The plan was both bizarre and deeply dangerous. LaRose was asked to fly to Europe, locate Vilks, and kill him, believing it would make her a martyr. She agreed. In August 2009, without telling anyone, she boarded a plane to Ireland with the intent to join others plotting the attack. But the reality of carrying out a murder was far more complicated than the online world had made it seem. Once overseas, LaRose struggled to follow through. She had difficulty coordinating with her contacts and lacked clear direction. After several weeks, she returned to the U.S. and was promptly arrested by the FBI, who had been monitoring her digital activity for months. Her online bravado had left a clear trail: emails, aliases, and messages detailing her plans and motivations. In custody, LaRose confessed to her role in the conspiracy and cooperated with investigators. She admitted to providing material support to terrorists, conspiring to commit murder overseas, and recruiting others to join extremist causes. What shocked many was not just her crime, but who she was. She didn't fit the stereotype. She wasn't from the Middle East, she didn't have a criminal background, and she had never stepped foot in a war zone. She was the woman next door. Prosecutors described LaRose as dangerously self-radicalized, noting that she had taken significant steps toward completing the mission, even if it ultimately failed. Her defense attorneys, meanwhile, emphasized her troubled past, mental health struggles, and vulnerability to manipulation. They portrayed her less as a hardened terrorist and more as someone who had been exploited by ideological predators online. In 2014, after 4 years in custody, Colleen LaRose was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. The relatively lenient sentence, given the gravity of the charges, was largely due to her cooperation with authorities and the fact that she never actually carried out an attack. She apologized in court, calling herself ashamed and regretful. The judge acknowledged her remorse, but also noted the seriousness of plotting to kill in the name of faith. The broader impact of LaRose's case was significant. She became a symbol of a growing concern, the power of the internet to radicalize individuals who might otherwise never come into contact with extremist ideologies. Her story highlighted how even those far from traditional radical hotbeds could be pulled into violent belief systems through a screen and a username. The nickname Jihad Jane became a media sensation, but experts warned that the label risked simplifying a complex issue. LaRose wasn't just a curiosity, she was a wake-up call. Her case underscored the need for more robust strategies to detect lone wolf actors, especially those radicalized in the shadows of the digital world. Since completing her sentence, LaRose has kept a low profile. She has not spoken publicly or granted interviews. Her whereabouts remain unknown, and she is believed to be under close supervision. Colleen LaRose didn't fire a gun or detonate a bomb, but she crossed a line, one where violent thoughts turned into tangible plans, and personal pain became political rage. And in doing so, she left behind more than a court record. She left a question that continues to haunt counterterrorism experts. How many more might be out there, quietly listening, quietly believing, and quietly waiting? Number 8. Deanna Laney. It was just past midnight on a warm May night in rural Texas when a mother placed a 911 call that would shake the nation. Her voice was calm, almost detached. "I killed my boys," she told the operator. When police arrived minutes later, they found a scene so unthinkable, even the most seasoned responders struggled to process it. 2 young boys lay lifeless in the backyard. A third, just over a year old, was clinging to life in his crib. The woman who had called was 38-year-old Deanna Laney, a mother of 3, devout Christian, and Sunday school teacher. She lived in a quiet home outside Tyler, Texas, surrounded by woods, far from city noise or public scrutiny. Friends and neighbors described her as gentle, kind, and devoted to her children. Her life revolved around church, family, and faith. But something had changed in the months leading up to that night. Slowly, quietly, she had begun to believe that God was speaking to her directly, and that he was asking her to make a sacrifice. In the spring of 2003, Laney began showing signs of deepening religious obsession. She told close friends that she was being tested by God, referencing stories from the Bible in increasingly literal terms. She believed the world was ending and that God had chosen her for a special mission. Most disturbing, she fixated on the story of Abraham, the Old Testament figure who was commanded to sacrifice his son, Isaac. Unlike in Scripture, where God intervened to stop Abraham, Laney believed she was being told to go through with it. On the night of May 9th, 2003, after her husband went to bed, Laney led her 2 eldest sons, Joshua, 8, and Luke, 6, into the backyard. Using heavy stones she had collected earlier, she struck each boy in the head until they stopped moving. She then returned to the house and attacked her youngest child, 14-month-old Aaron, as he lay in his crib. Miraculously, he survived, though with severe head trauma. After the killings, Laney called 911 and calmly confessed. When officers arrived, she showed them where to find the bodies. She made no attempt to flee or resist. Later, during questioning, she explained that she believed God had told her to do it, that it was a test of faith, and that she trusted he would bring her sons back to life if she obeyed his command. Her case sparked national outrage and confusion. How could a seemingly loving mother commit such an act? How could anyone believe God would ask them to kill their children? As prosecutors built their case, it became clear that Laney was suffering from a severe psychotic disorder. She had no history of violence, substance abuse, or criminal behavior. But in the months before the killings, she had shown clear signs of religious delusion, symptoms of psychosis deeply entangled with her spiritual beliefs. In court, 5 separate mental health experts, including those brought in by the prosecution, testified that Laney was in a state of active psychosis at the time of the crime. She had experienced religious hallucinations, believed she was communicating directly with God, and was unable to distinguish right from wrong. One expert described her condition as the perfect storm of untreated mental illness and extreme spiritual obsession. The trial began in 2004. The jury faced a daunting decision. Was Laney criminally responsible for her actions, or was she legally insane? After reviewing the testimony and evidence, they reached a verdict that stunned some and relieved others. Not guilty by reason of insanity. Rather than facing life in prison, Laney was committed to North Texas State Hospital, a maximum security psychiatric facility. Her case reignited fierce debates across the U.S. about the use of the insanity defense, especially in crimes involving religious delusion. For some, the ruling felt like justice, an acknowledgement of severe mental illness. For others, it felt like a failure of accountability. Over the years, Laney remained under intensive psychiatric care. Reports from doctors indicated gradual improvement, and after lengthy evaluations, she was eventually granted conditional release. The decision was not taken lightly. Courts and clinicians agreed that she no longer posed a threat to herself or others, provided she remained under close supervision, took prescribed medications, and followed strict treatment protocols. Elizabeth Smart's case had also brought national focus to religion-related criminal cases. But while Wanda Barzee knowingly enabled a captor's abuse under the guise of prophecy, Deanna Laney acted alone, her mind consumed by voices she believed were divine. Today, Laney lives in a supervised setting outside of public view. Her surviving son, Aaron, was raised by extended family and has largely stayed out of the spotlight. He carries with him not only the trauma of the attack, but the burden of being the child who lived. Deanna Laney's case is one of the most haunting examples of what can happen when untreated mental illness and intense spiritual belief collide. It forces uncomfortable questions about accountability, faith, and the limits of the human mind. And it leaves behind a devastating truth. Sometimes, the most terrifying danger doesn't come from hatred or cruelty, but from a love so twisted by illness that it no longer recognizes itself. Number 9. Allison Fluke-Ekren. When authorities finally brought her back to U.S. soil in 2022, even seasoned federal agents struggled to reconcile who she had become with where she came from. A former teacher from Kansas, fluent in English and well-educated, had risen through the ranks of ISIS in Syria, becoming a commander, recruiter, and instructor in one of the most feared terrorist organizations in the world. Her name was Allison Fluke-Ekren, but in the Caliphate they called her Muhammad al-Amriki, the American mother of war. Born and raised in Overbrook, Kansas, Fluke-Ekren seemed destined for an ordinary life. She earned a biology degree from the University of Kansas, and later worked as a teacher, married young, and raised children. For years, she lived quietly in the Midwest, far removed from any visible signs of extremism. But sometime after 2008, her life took a sharp and secretive turn. After moving overseas with her husband, a known ISIS operative, Fluke-Ekren became deeply embedded in radical Islamist circles. From Egypt to Libya and eventually Syria, she followed her husband into territories controlled by extremist militias. As ISIS rose to power, she didn't just follow from the sidelines, she actively stepped into leadership. According to U.S. prosecutors, Fluke-Ekren helped establish and lead Katiba Nusayba, an all-female battalion based in Raqqa, the former ISIS capital. She trained more than 100 women and girls, some as young as teenagers, in the use of firearms, suicide belts, and battlefield tactics. Witnesses described her as strict, commanding, and entirely committed to the Islamic State's ideology. Fluke-Ekren reportedly glorified martyrdom and encouraged others to pursue it. She would drill her recruits with AK-47s and grenades, telling them their highest honor was to die for the cause. Girls under her instruction were taught not only how to fight, but how to think, indoctrinated in violent extremism disguised as divine truth. Her influence didn't stop at the borders of Syria. At various points during her time with ISIS, Fluke-Ekren allegedly discussed plans to orchestrate terrorist attacks on American soil. One proposal involved targeting a university campus. Another involved detonating a car bomb in a U.S. shopping mall. While those attacks were never carried out, the discussions alone highlighted how far she was willing to go, and how deep her transformation had become. Fluke-Ekren's path eventually unraveled after the fall of the ISIS caliphate. As Syrian territory shrank and the group lost its strongholds, she went into hiding. In early 2022, she was captured by local authorities and extradited to the United States, where she was arrested on federal terrorism charges. In court, she faced a mountain of evidence. Former recruits testified about her teachings. Digital communications revealed her involvement in operational discussions, and intelligence officials painted her as one of the most prominent American women to have joined ISIS, not just as a supporter, but as a leader and organizer. Faced with overwhelming testimony, Fluke-Ekren pleaded guilty to one count of conspiring to provide material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization. During her sentencing hearing in November 2022, she attempted to downplay certain allegations and expressed regret. But the judge made it clear her actions had empowered a terrorist organization, endangered children, and inspired violence against civilians. She was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, the maximum allowable under the charge. The courtroom heard from some of her own family members, including her daughter, who described years of psychological and emotional abuse while living under their mother's extremist rule. Her daughter testified that Fluke-Ekren had used ideology as a weapon, twisting scripture to justify control and cruelty, and celebrating violence as holy. Her case became one of the most high-profile examples of Westerners, especially women, who joined ISIS in leadership roles. While male combatants often draw headlines, Fluke-Ekren revealed the organizational and ideological power that female operatives could wield. She wasn't merely a supporter. She was a teacher of war, a planner of attacks, and a symbol of how radical ideology can reshape even the most unlikely lives. For counterterrorism experts, her story is a cautionary tale. It showed how an educated, middle-class American could descend into extremism, not through poverty or coercion, but through belief. Belief strong enough to abandon her country, her career, and even her children to pursue what she claimed was a divine mission. Today, Allison Fluke-Ekren is serving her sentence in a federal prison facility. She is barred from any contact with extremist organizations, and her name is permanently etched into the record of American citizens who turned against their homeland in the name of ideology. And yet, her story continues to echo. In courtrooms, in de-radicalization programs, and in the silent fear that somewhere else, someone is watching, listening, and beginning to believe the same lies. Number 10. Magalie Bamu. On Christmas Day 2010, emergency services were called to a flat in East London. What they found inside wasn't a family gathering or a festive tragedy. It was something far darker. A 15-year-old boy lay lifeless in a bathtub, his body bruised, beaten, and soaked. His name was Christy Bamu, and what had been done to him was almost beyond comprehension. Even more chilling, the person responsible was his own sister. Magalie Bamu was 28 years old, a British woman of Congolese origin living in Newham with her boyfriend, Eric Bakubi. She came from a large family and had moved to the UK as a teenager. Outwardly, she led a quiet, ordinary life. But behind closed doors, both she and Bakubi held deeply ingrained beliefs rooted in Kindoki, a form of witchcraft feared in some Congolese communities. In their world, spiritual possession wasn't metaphorical. It was something to be fought, violently, if necessary. In December 2010, Christie and his siblings traveled from Paris to London to visit Magalie for the holidays. It was supposed to be a family reunion. Instead, it became a days-long nightmare. Shortly after their arrival, Bakubi began accusing Christie of bringing evil spirits into the flat. Magalie agreed. Fueled by paranoia, religious obsession, and escalating rage, the couple claimed Christie was practicing witchcraft and said he needed an exorcism. What followed was a campaign of torture. Over the course of several days, Christie was beaten with metal bars, a hammer, floor tiles, and even a pair of pliers. At one point, they forced him to pray for deliverance. At another, they made him confess to being possessed. The violence was relentless. Neighbors later reported hearing noises, but never imagined what was happening inside. Throughout it all, Christie's siblings, some younger than him, were also accused and threatened, but Christie bore the brunt of the attack. By the end, he was barely able to stand. According to testimony, he begged his sister and Bakubi to let him die. And then they drowned him in the bathtub. He was 15 years old. After the murder, Magalie called emergency services. When police arrived, they found the flat in disarray, blood on the floors, broken furniture, and terrified children. Christie's body was in the tub, and his injuries were extensive, over 100 separate wounds. Magalie and Bakubi were arrested at the scene. In interviews, both confessed to believing Christie had been practicing Kindoki. They claimed the violence was an attempt to purge him of demonic influence, a belief imported from sectarian Christian teachings that blended scripture with superstition. But prosecutors made it clear, whatever they believed, what they did was torture. Their trial began in 2012 at the Old Bailey, one of Britain's most high-profile courts. Jurors heard harrowing testimony from Christie's siblings, who had witnessed parts of the ordeal. The prosecution presented the crime as a tragic mix of fanaticism, control, and cruelty. They argued that Magalie and Bakubi had become fixated on religious delusion and used it to justify sadistic violence. The court was told that Bakubi had a history of mental health issues, but was aware enough to understand his actions. Magalie, for her part, showed little emotion in court. She admitted to participating in the violence, but often deflected responsibility, blaming Bakubi's influence. Still, the jury saw through the defense. In March 2012, both Magalie Bamu and Eric Bakubi were found guilty of murder. At sentencing, the judge delivered a stern rebuke. He acknowledged that belief in witchcraft may have been genuine, but emphasized that no belief, however sincere, could excuse such brutality. He called the torture prolonged, sadistic, and ultimately fatal. Bakubi was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years, while Magalie received a minimum of 25 years before becoming eligible for parole. The case sent shockwaves through the UK, not only because of the horrifying details, but because it exposed an undercurrent of imported superstition that had gone unchecked. British authorities had previously recorded smaller incidents involving Kindoki-based abuse, especially toward children, but Christie's death brought the issue into painful focus. In response, the government increased awareness campaigns in immigrant communities and schools, urging vigilance against harmful traditional beliefs disguised as religion. Social services also reevaluated their outreach efforts, especially in communities where fear of spiritual possession was still prevalent. But no policy change could undo what happened to Christie. His murder was not just a family tragedy. It was a failure on multiple levels. A failure to recognize the danger of unchecked beliefs, a failure to protect a child in crisis, and a failure by two adults who turned faith into violence. Today, Magalie Bamu remains in prison, serving a life sentence for helping end her brother's life. The home that once held their reunion is long empty, but its memory lingers, a grim reminder of what can happen when superstition becomes justification and when love is warped by fear. And that brings us to the end of the video. If you found this interesting, consider dropping a like, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss a video. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which of these cases stayed with you the most? And where in the world are you watching from? Thanks again for watching. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.